Hello and welcome back to HEMA Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the gold medal Rapier and Dagger match between Rob Childs and Aryck Copley at Socal Swordfight 2025. Normally I don't really delve into the realm of Rapier and Dagger too much, but on this particular occasion we have two legends in the sport who are competing, and in particular I'd like to take careful note of Rob Childs, who has been an explosively successful Rapier and Dagger fighter for a very long time, and probably will for a very long time in the future. And I feel like breaking down his pretty unique style was something that a lot of people could use to get into Rapier and Dagger, not just because he's so good, but also particularly because he has a YouTube channel of his own where he breaks down how he fights all the time. So it might be a little bit of old information if you watch his videos, but for everybody else, this is a great place to learn some of the real high level core tenets of a really good Rapier and Dagger fencer. So for our first exchange, we have an interesting one, not necessarily in the points that are scored or really the attack that is made, but particularly in the way that both of these fencers present their starting position or their guard. Now, in Rapier and Dagger, obviously you have two weapons, but one of them is really more of a weapon than the other. And as a direct result, there's a lot you can learn about how someone sets themselves up in Rapier and Dagger that tells you a lot about what kinds of targets they're going for. In Rob Childs' position, who is on the left here, though if the camera changes a few times, he starts always with his right leg forward, and he is right-handed, and he keeps his rapier down by that leg. And this is a very interesting starting position because what it essentially says is, I am going to flick my tip up, and you might see me go low for a stab to the gut. You might see me go high for a stab to the shoulder. I might even go all the way to the face. But then more importantly, as a thing that Rob Childs also does, is that he will use that preparatory motion of raising his tip up to actually chamber a cut that then comes back down onto the hand or onto the leg, meaning that his initial action is so well disguised by this starting position that you don't really know where to put your defensive measure, your dagger, in order to try to counteract it. Now from Aryck, what we see here is he keeps his dagger rather low and close to his sword. And I believe part of the reason that he is doing this is, one, he does not have a full sail dagger, so he can't hold it out quite in front of him like a buckler like we see Rob Childs do here. But also, similarly, I believe that what he really wants to make sure of is that when he goes for these parries with his dagger to these upper openings like his shoulder, his chest, or his head, he wants to make sure that he's windshield wipering off to that left side. And the reason that's very important to do is because, much like in longsword, anything that's coming down vertical, straight down on top of your head, or is just being projectiled up towards your head in that direction, has a lot of distance to travel if you have to windshield wiper it up. So if you do a typical kind of cron parry, although with a dagger, you're not going to get the best results. So instead, what you're essentially doing are a lot of really quick crump hows with your dagger. These windshield wipery left and right techniques are much more effective at setting something like a very linear thrust offline, and because you are using a dagger, your blade is basically nothing but strong. You're always going to have a superior leverage point if you manage to get there. So for this very, very specific interaction, what we see here is Rob feint in, or I guess it's not even really a feint, but he lunges in with his right leg, pulls his tip all the way from being pointed down to being pointed up, and comes in at a very steep angled thrust right into the front left shoulder of Aryck. Now, the parry that Aryck does is exactly the one that I described. He attempts to windshield wiper off to the side, but he is just not quite quick enough. And one of the really smart things about aiming for the lead shoulder, in any case, regardless of whether there's a dagger or not, is that it's often very, very close to you, and because it is a right hand versus left shoulder deal, the straight line that you can take in order to put your tip directly into that opposing shoulder is in a lot of ways just as quick as going for the lead shoulder, but because it's Rapier and Dagger, people tend to stand more square, and their left shoulder is much more in presence than it normally would be. For our next exchange, we have our first adaptation from Aryck, and it pertains particularly to the dagger position that both of these fighters are fencing from. Both of them have a rather low rapier position, though Aryck's is a little bit higher than Rob's. Similarly, Rob starts with a very high dagger position, holding it out in front of his shoulder like a buckler, which means that technically speaking, he has a little bit of an opening in his lower left hip. basically meaning that he has a lot of distance to travel with his left hand if he wants to go down, and he has a lot of distance to travel with his right hand if he wants to try to parry with the rapier because it has to cross his body line. So, seeing this kind of opening, Aryck goes for a nice big thrust straight to that lower left hip of Rob in an attempt to seek that opening and take advantage of the hole in his defense. And it looks like he makes it. Now, Rob tries to pull a very interesting defensive measure in order to defend that lower left opening, which is a dolphin step, something I've described before. And basically what it is that you suck in your gut and you shuffle both of your feet backwards simultaneously while leaving your upper body hanging in the air. The reason this is a really smart defensive measure is because when someone goes low, just moving your body out of the way is obviously a great thing to do, but leaving your upper body in the same position that it was means that you're much more poised to throw a afterblow or a parry riposte if you manage to get the parry. So simultaneously, Rob is trying to take away the target that Aryck is seeking and leaving himself in a position where he can throw a nice afterblow. Now, in this exchange, it does look like Aryck manages to reach his target, but in order to do so, he has to take a passing step with his dominant leg, or at least a very, very deep lunge, and as a result, he can't get out of measure fast enough or parry the afterblow that Rob Childs was already cocked and ready to throw. So the result is a nice stab from Aryck and then a follow-up thrust from Rob Childs, but you can already see the ways in which both of these fencers are trying to probe each other's defenses and find the spot that they're best at defending and worst at defending. Now, our next exchange is a pretty fast and simple one, and it goes back to something I mentioned earlier that Rob Childs loves to do. One is to start from this low position so that he can disguise all of the openings for all of his attacks to look almost identical. And you can see the setup and payoff happen here in real time. He throws a thrust towards Aryck's head, which gets parried in combination with some defensive footwork. But now, knowing that this is Aryck's predetermined option, what Rob Childs does next is he throws that feint, that exact same looking thrust towards the head, sees Aryck throw the exact same form of defense, but then turns his raised tip into a cut low to the leg, meaning that from this exact same starting position, Rob can simultaneously threaten your head and your leg, and as a result, you have to almost guess which form of defense is going to work. If you try to parry high, you'll take care of that thrust to the top, but if you parry high and he goes low, there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to properly defend that leg, except, of course, with maybe a little dolphin step of your own or some very, very fast footwork backwards. Of course, the problem is that a lunge is a very, very quick and very, very deep committed form of footwork that if you overcommit to, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get afterblowed. But because this is Rapier and Dagger, one of the things that you can always do is commit a little bit harder to some extremities while always having your defense cocked and ready to go if you know that afterblow is going to come. Next up, we have another exchange that showcases another tool in Rob Childs' toolbox, namely one that works off of the same exact starting position that pretty much all of his attacks come from, but this time it goes low, not in a cut to the leg, but a thrust to the leg. And there are some key differences between the two that make this significantly more effective in certain situations. One, as we see Rob Childs probing with these feinted thrusts or feinted cuts up high, forcing his opponent to be aware of them and ever so slightly raise the level of his dagger. Raising the level of your dagger doesn't really have that much of an impact, but at the end of the day, getting Aryck to constantly think about these thrusts to the head means that that's probably the form of defense he's going to throw first when he sees Rob Childs engage. So, knowing that, Rob Childs flicks up his tip, engages the reaction that Aryck has pre-planned, but then deviates and goes down into a thrust to the lead leg. And the reason why this is maybe a little bit better than a cut is two particular reasons. One, when you're throwing a cut, you really rely on the flick of the tip in the first bit to set up the curve of the tip in the second bit. That really makes it a cut. Whereas being able to simply gesture your tip up and then deviate back in another different direction is a lot more confusing, and it will look like a low stab that isn't necessarily going towards the leg but could really be going anywhere. So, as a result, it's a much more confusing action to take, plus sometimes you can just make it a stab to the belly, which in most Rapier rule sets is going to be worth more points than a stab to the leg. But the other option here is that most people who are doing Olympic fencing footwork with their dominant leg footwork are going to do it in the exact same way as most Olympic fencers do it, which is namely to move one foot into a new position and then pull the other foot to match. If you are doing Olympic fencing footwork and you want to move forward, you move your right leg forward a couple inches and then you pull your left leg back. But if you're going backwards, you move your left leg backwards a couple inches and then you have to pull your right leg back to match. And what that means is that without an execution of the dolphin step, which I talked about earlier, this leaves your right leg hanging out in the air a little bit longer than sometimes people mean to. Meaning that if you're in a position where you don't want to go for the left hip because that's maybe just a little bit too far pulled back, similarly, when someone does a backward motion, a backward shuffle step, their left hip is actually going to move first. So it's often a more viable target to go for that right leg because it's going to be hanging out in the air a little bit longer. Similarly, blocking the entirely opposite quadrant of your dagger is pretty difficult, and pairing with the rapier is often too slow. So the right thigh is still a really, really great target to go for. Next up, we have an adaptation again from Aryck. Now, one of the things that Aryck has been dealing with this entire match is these baited, flicking, probing strikes that he just doesn't know where they're going. But they're all coming in along the line of his left side. So, as you see, about halfway through this exchange, Aryck manages to parry another very fast, very effective thrust towards his left side and realizes that maybe one of the ways around this is to actually void that side of his body. So you can almost see him shrug his shoulders and then pull his left arm back a little bit into a more reserved position. And as a result, he starts fencing a little bit more like a traditional Olympic fencer. He's got his left arm back, he's got his left side back, and this angle takes away a lot of these targets on the left side of his body, including, in some ways, his head. Now, what we see here, again, from this adaptation is an immediate counter-adaptation from Rob Childs. Rob sees him pull his left arm back. He sees him start to try to void those targets, and he sees him start to get a little bit more side face, which would make those targets a little bit harder to hit. And as a result, he goes for the opposite target. He immediately throws, with almost zero time to calculate, a big ballistic thrust toward the right shoulder of his opponent, and then at the exact same time does a little bit of almost boxing style footwork where he tries to void his head off to that left side in order to make sure that he doesn't get counter stabbed. Unfortunately, it doesn't really quite work out for him, and he doesn't get the dominant line when he throws that initial stab, so he basically gets afterblowed or at least simultaneously stabbed right in the chest. Now, the reason that this exchange is so important to point out is because Rapier, single Rapier, is all about line work. But Rapier Dagger isn't less so about line work, but more difficult to make about line work because there are so many different interactions that you can have between the two weapons that are now made for between the two fighters. So if you're going for a move like the one Rob Childs does here, it's very, very beneficial to make sure that you are on the outside line, essentially turning this back into a single rapier match as quickly as possible, especially when your opponent has just shown you that they want to keep their left side back and thus are taking their dagger a little bit out of play. Of course, it's difficult to get an outside line in a rapier dagger match because most people who are fully aware of this interaction are going to keep their right side also pretty far back and reserved, meaning that seeking that bind and getting that outside line bind is pretty much impossible if your opponent just doesn't want to give it to you. So, in sense, there's nothing that anybody really did wrong here, so much as it was a unique interaction that really only had one possible result, as long as nobody made a mistake. Now, in this particular exchange, we see another adaptation from Aryck, and in my opinion, this was the really, really great one that, in my opinion, showed a one and true hole in Rob Child's seemingly invincible defense. And that was his ability to feint low and then cut to the hand. Now, I've been talking all the time about how Rob Childs loves to disguise his attacks by starting from the similar position, but I want to make sure to make people understand that Aryck is doing the exact same thing. Aryck also has his rapier pulled back pretty far, and from that position, he can threaten virtually any target, but the initial kind of actions of any one of these attacks are all going to look identical. And here we see that interaction play out from the other direction. Aryck throws a thrust forward, which could be basically anywhere, and we see Rob Childs respond by actually trying to parry low. What this is really telling you is that In some ways, throwing a defense in Rapier Dagger can often come down to a little bit of guesswork. Even Rob Childs, who is so very, very good at Rapier and Dagger, sometimes still takes an educated guess at where he thinks that attack is coming from, and it also tells you a little bit about why he can keep his dagger so high. You would keep your dagger high in some cases to make sure that anyone who wants to go for your face has a big dagger to go through, but also it can tell your opponent that you do have an opening low, as we saw Aryck try to adapt to earlier. And now what Rob Childs can do is, when in doubt, simply parry low and do the dolphin step and probably get the better of most of these exchanges. But in this particular case, Aryck clearly has that figured out, so he feints that stab. Rob immediately tries to parry low, only to find that there's nothing there. And what Aryck does to follow up is actually really intelligent here, because he pulls his tip up and just goes for a cut on the outside of the dagger arm. And this is really key, because when you're holding your dagger out in front of you and you parry low, chances are the next thing that's going to come, if you know that someone has just fainted, is that they're going to come high. So this is what you're going to do. You're going to windshield wiper from down low, 6 o'clock position, all the way to 12 o'clock position. But this outside part of your hand is going to be open the entire time. And this is a really smart thing to go for. The only problem is that it's just a hand shot. And while cuts to the hand sometimes definitely score in Rapier and Dagger, they're never worth as much as a thrust. So maybe the slightly better version of this would be to try to sneak a thrust through here into maybe the dominant side or the non-dominant side shoulder. But I can definitely see how that would require a hell of a lot more commitment, and one that might not work so well off of this same setup. But like I said, this is a really, really smart adaptation, and it is a very, very clean and effective way of getting points, particularly on Rob Childs, who is clearly relying on his high dagger position to make sure that he can parry low, sometimes maybe without thinking about it. Now, I would be remiss to call this next one an adaptation so much as an execution of a bread and butter Rapier Dagger technique, but what is interesting about it is the setup. Now, one thing that you see all the time in Rapier Dagger is an interaction where somebody lunges forward with their dominant leg, throws that dominant side thrust, same as they would in single Rapier, but the exact same time as they're doing this, they're going to reach forward with their left dagger and try to parry your sword out of the way at the exact same time as they do it. The reason for this is obvious. One, when you have two weapons, you can attack and defend simultaneously, and that's something you should always be thinking about. But two, one of the real bread and butter interactions of single Rapier is the beat attack and then follow up lunging thrust. And the reason that's so effective is because often you can take away your opponent's defense at the exact same time as you throw offense of your own. So if you throw a big lunge in Rapier Dagger, it's always sort of acknowledge that you're going to be trying to do something with your dagger at the same time, if only to make sure that you don't get doubled out. And here we see Rob Childs doing that exact thing. He does a very big lunge, he smacks his opponent's rapier out of the way and manages to get in past the dagger of his opponent by thrusting low towards a little bit on the hip line. Now, why is this unique to Rob Childs? Well, in one particular instance, it is because of the dagger position that Rob Childs always holds. He always holds his dagger out like a buckler, almost at full extension in front of his left side. Now, one, this obviously offers up a lot of defensive options because he has that full sail guard and you can't just stab him in the hands. Two, the other form of defense comes in the fact that when your arm is at full extension, it is in a straight line, which means there's not these little bits of elbow sticking out that you could maybe snipe. Three, though, is that pulling out your dagger as far as you possibly can also means that it's always going to be closer to your opponent's rapier, assuming that you're both right-handed or both left-handed. And the reason that interaction is so important is on this particular execution, when you lunge in deep and you try to smack your opponent's rapier out of the way, one of the key factors of this is how much closer your dagger is to your opponent's sword than their dagger is to your sword. This again emphasizes the starting positions that both of these fencers are starting from. Rob Childs' rapier is so low and so far out of the way that it's keeping it far away from his opponent's dagger. His dagger is so far forward that it's probably trying to get as close to his opponent's rapier as it possibly can without just being able to touch it from standing still. At the exact same time, Aryck loves to keep his dagger back a little bit more shallow and closer to his rapier, which means that Rob Childs has a little bit more distance to travel and figure out exactly where the holes in that dagger defense are before he reaches his target. Now, keeping your dagger back isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's really just more of a defensive thing. And what that means is that when Rob, who keeps his dagger out so far, goes for this offensive beat attack simultaneous lunge thrust thing, he's going to have a little bit easier time of pulling it off because his dagger is in the more offensive position. Now, this next one is not an adaptation at all. It's actually a repeat of something that we've already seen, but I wanted to take special emphasis and place a little bit of respect on Aryck's name here because he manages to pull off this fake hand snipe thing twice, but more importantly, he manages to do it while getting Rob Childs to parry 2, 3, 4 times in a row without getting any blade on any of them. And this is a really important thing to understand because Rapier and Dagger is very, very, very fast, which means that oftentimes parrying comes more from instinct and an understanding of distance and timing than it really does from being able to react to wherever your opponent is going. So Aryck comes out in this exchange, clearly showing dominance in the mid-range and throwing these probing strikes out there that Rob Childs is constantly fishing for and trying to parry. Nothing really wrong with that. But what you see is the exact same setup and payoff that Rob has pulled off on him earlier. He is seeing the exact predetermined responses that Rob Childs has every single time a point comes near his face, and he's going to take full advantage of that by threatening towards his face, waiting for Rob to whiff a parry, pulling off, and then throwing a cut to the outside of the dagger arm. And it works again beautifully. And when you watch this in slow motion, what you see is Rob go for multiple parries in a row, almost in a panicked state, because he knows as soon as he tried to parry that first attack that it was a feint, which means that chances are he's going to come right back up to the high line. He tries to parry that, and it's not even there. And which person goes, oh no, now my low line is open. And he tries to parry low again. And this entire time he's doing this windshield wiper, at no point did he actually cover the area that Aryck was actually going for, the outside of that dagger arm. And so he gets it almost for free. It is a really, really effective setup and payoff, and one that anyone should probably be using if they're doing Rapier and Dagger, and hell, if they're doing Sword and Buckler, because in a lot of ways, having a paired weapon that's defensive-oriented on your offline is going to result in very similar sorts of situations. While you don't do a windshield wiper parry in the same way with a Buckler, because it just doesn't do anything, the principle is still the same. Every single time you see something come at you, you're going to do some kind of response with your defensive implement. And if you can game and predict what those responses are going to be, finding your openings, particularly on that defensive implemented arm, is going to be a really great way to get some free points. So this brings us to the final exchange of not one, but two actual fights between these two. I don't know if you noticed, but about halfway through this video, the timer resets up at the top. And that's because both of these were a 3-part fight. As you probably remember from the video on the gold medal match for Tier A Longsword, in the gold medal match, they give you a 3-fight run, and the winner is the person who wins the most out of those 3 fights. 2 to win, 1 to lose. So the idea here is that Rob Childs has effectively won twice in a row, and as a result, won the overall thing. And this is the last exchange of the second fight. But what's really important to point out here isn't just the technique that lands him the points that wins him the gold medal, but also the setup that he does first. Now, in this particular video camera angle, we get a normally very bad angle, one where we're just looking straight at Rob Childs' back. But what's interesting about this angle is in this particular execution of his setup and his feinted attack, we actually see a really interesting angle being taken. When Rob does his first thrust that doesn't land, he almost scoops it from his lower right side to his left side and then comes up on that off angle towards the face of his opponent. And this is a really, really unusual way to try to throw a thrust. So why is he doing it? Well, in my opinion, the reason he's doing it is he's trying to capitalize on 2 things. One, the fact that the dagger often has to push to the inside in order to parry anything that's coming up and under. Meaning that if you are coming up and under and going for, say, a belly stab, oftentimes if you meet up in here, the dagger has to push you down so far before it can start to scoop you off to the side. And scooping off to the side is where the actual defense lies. pushing the rapier down simply pushes the target that you're getting stabbed in from maybe the center of your chest to more like your crotch, and that's not always the great outcome that you want it to be. So, as a result, by scooping from the lower right to the lower left and then coming up on this weird angle, what Rob is essentially doing is making sure that he's engaging with the dagger if he gets parried during the middle of the scoop, which means that it's probably just going to push his thrust down low and still result in a landing. But there is another aspect here, which is that you can really take advantage of this scoop thing from the right side. So why does he really go onto the left side to perform this technique? And in my opinion, the reason for that is because he also wants to make sure that he can box out the opponent's rapier. One of the things about throwing a big lunge is that you have to take your left arm with you. And when you're an Olympic fencer and you're doing a single rapier match, you will often throw that left shoulder back as far as you can to make sure that it's not there as a target. However, when this is your defensive implement, you not only have to take it with you, but you often have to have it as far forward as your right shoulder. This is a unique interaction where you can actually throw that left shoulder back with abandon, and that's because you're taking the inside line and basically scooping up and almost going into an encartada so that you can make sure that if your opponent is trying to thrust you at the exact same time, they're going to be on the outside line, and there's a decent chance that you will have the inside bind and have a dominant line so that if they do scoop you directly into your lower opening, you're still probably going to get that little bit of bind in the middle and defend yourself. At the exact same time, the opening that they would be able to hit if they tried to contest your inside line is your left side, so throwing it back with that abandon is actually giving you the best of all of those worlds. You're throwing a technique that can get parried and then still probably make it to its target. You're throwing a technique that has an inside line bind, so if you do interact rapier to rapier, you might have a pretty good shot at getting the better of that, and you're throwing your non-dominant side out of the way, ensuring that you're relying entirely on your inside line to be your defense, but you're also voiding the target that's most likely to get hit if that defense fails. It's a really great setup, and it just flat out doesn't land. What does land at the end is, of course, another execution of the classic lunge in, parry with the dagger, the rapier out of the way, and then just lunge straight to the belly. It's not exactly as exciting as maybe that initial shot was, and I certainly would have loved to have seen what would have happened if Rob had managed to land one of those, but in this particular instance, we can only see the setup. So, if you want to see more footage like this, feel free to subscribe because I'm going to be doing all kinds of more Socal fights. There were so many good fighters and so many good fights to cover that I'll probably won't run out for at least a month. But if you want to do some Rapier Dagger or submit some footage of your own, you can do so with my email down in the description, and I will see you next week.